Unbeknownst to me, this project began the day I made the decision to attend Purdue University after graduating high school in 2004. I went from walking across Westall High School stage and looking at my 49 classmates to moving into a dorm at Purdue that housed about the same number of people who lived in my town, from a town of 800 people to a university of over 40,000. It would be my first experience as a rural out migrant, and from that moment on, every decision I made and every experience I had was as someone who had left her farm to live on or near a campus whose population alone was about 400 times that of her town. Every decision I made, every experience I had was as a rural out migrant. I just didn't know it. And it is those experiences which served as the primary reasons I undertook this study. Moving from a community of less than 1,000 residents to a large university, then back to a small community, then to the outskirts of Austin, Texas, has made me aware of pieces of my identity and the ways they affect me in a way I had never realized before. To say the first year of college was difficult would be a gross understatement. More than once, I considered dropping out and moving back home. Having been with the same friends since kindergarten as an established member of my rural community, attending a university with over 40,000 students made me feel absolutely lost, a total outsider. I didn't know where to go or how to find people like me that may have been experiencing similar struggles, and the one person on campus I did know was in a different program and not one of my better friends to begin with. I realize now that there were probably many other rural out-migrant students experiencing the same thing, but no way to connect with them. For example, there's no rural out-migrant center on campus, no rural out-migrant club, and no way to recognize a rural out-migrant on site, indicating the invisibility of this experience. On top of struggling to find community, learning how to apply for financial aid, navigating the various registrar and aid offices, and trying to find a job to keep myself afloat was more than anxiety-inducing. My mom tried to keep the "I told you so" out of her voice during every tearful phone call, of which there were many. But underneath every encouragement, there it was. I went home nearly every weekend that first year, wondering how I was ever going to make it through 3 more years, and I began to understand why no one in my dad's family had graduated from college, even though he and my uncle had enrolled and completed some credits. After changing my major to English and spending more time on campus, I eventually made friends and became a member of a few groups who made me feel mostly like a community member. I also moved to an apartment complex surrounded by fields, which felt more like my 80-acre farm than living in the dorms. And after finishing my bachelor's degree in literature, I completed 2 extra years to gain my teacher's license. Most of my teaching placements were in smaller schools. My student teaching placement was a 45-minute drive through corn and soybean fields away from campus. When it came time to apply for jobs, there was no teacher shortage and finding a job was difficult. Even so, I never considered applying for jobs located in cities or even large suburbs. I was convinced that teaching in a rural school would be perfect, comfortable for me, because that's all I had ever really known, and I realized that I'd missed it. I was extremely caught off guard and disappointed to find that despite my rural background, the rural community I eventually taught in still considered me an outsider for my more liberal and progressive politics. I was surprised at how difficult it was to build relationships with a significant number of my students and colleagues because of it. My instructional choices and practices, for example, foregrounding issues of social justice, teaching multicultural literature, assigning creative projects rather than 5-paragraph essays, seemed to play a role in the disconnect I felt between colleagues and students as well. Students and colleagues alike questioned why everything had to be about race with me. One of my mentors encouraged me by telling me I was faring better than the other city folks who had moved on after spending a year or 2 at the school. It seemed I was somewhere in the middle of the rural to urban spectrum. I was an insider in some ways because I understood more about farming, rural culture, and country values, but I was still an outsider because I believed in the reality of white privilege and pursuing a more socially just society. Though I expected to be recognized and accepted as a rural member of the community, I found that the reality was much more complex than my expectations had realized. there, friends, and welcome to another episode of Reading Rule, y'all. I am your host, Dr. Chea Parton, coming to you from a somewhat overcast day here in central Hoosierland. It's a nice day, but it was a little bit cloudy in the beginning of the day. It seems like maybe they're kind of going away. I'm also coming to you with a broken tibia. So one of the fun things about being closer to home is that I get to participate in things like alumni basketball games where I try to relive my high school days playing. And I think I just went a little too hard and I now have an impact fracture in the top of my tibia. So that's fun. But luckily, it doesn't affect my ability to host this podcast and talk about books. And so here I am, happy to be here and excited to talk to you about today's book because it's mine. Growing up, I always dreamed of writing a book. I participated in young authors, and a couple of my stories, won awards or whatever in that young authors program. But I just never thought that a rural kid like me, a farm kid who had no desire to and didn't want to move to Chicago or LA or New York, whatever, publish anything. But I did, and the cover is beautiful. And even though it's not fiction, it's still a book. I still wrote a whole book and I can't believe it. So we're going to talk about that today. But before we do, I have a number of announcements. So just hang on to your seats because here we go. The first one is that the Literacy in Place Rural Teen Writing Contest submission portal is now open. Yay! So encourage those rural teen writers in your lives, grades 9 through 12, to submit their stories. And if you're a rural ELA teacher, I hope that you will make room in your writing curriculum for students to write memoir or poetry or short stories, flash fiction. It's open genre, so really whatever they want, whatever genre they feel most confident about and most comfortable in, they can write about their rural experiences and submit it. I always do a theme, so this year's theme is Eat, Dance, and Be Rural, celebrating diverse rural cultures. And the contest is open to anybody who identifies as rural or who has deep connections to rural places. And like I said, it's open genre. One of the coolest things about this national contest is that I get to read the pieces, but I don't have to judge them, because that's really hard. So I leave that to the professionals. And I always have guest judges. So my rural author friends always step up in a big way to help me out with this. And so students' work will be evaluated by real-life published authors. This year, our judges are best-selling author Kaylin Bayron, author of the Whippoorwill Award-winning This Poison Heart. She also has a new book out called You're Not Supposed to Die Tonight, which looks amazing. Pedro Hoffmeister is another judge. His book, Too Shattered for Mending, is one of my favorites of all time, honestly. It's such a good book. I think about it all the time. And he's got some new stuff out too. His newest release is called American Afterlife, and that was also amazing. Not really rural, but I have heard tell that one of the follow-up books in this series will feature a rural person in a rural story. So keep your eye out for that. I'm excited. And then the last judge is Tarina Elizabeth Bell, whose award-winning experimental short story collection, Tell Me What You See, is some of the best writing I've read in a long time. I loved that collection so much. And I love Tarina too. She's amazing. They're going to provide feedback on stories who make the short list, even if those stories don't win. And so folks who submit will likely get feedback on their work from published authors, which I would have killed for as a student and aspiring writer in high school. So tell your friends, tell your rural writer friends, your young writer friends to submit their work, because even if you don't win, there are still some really cool opportunities to engage with published writers. The other cool thing is the prizes. So if they do win, first prize this year will receive a class set of the Whippoorwill Award-winning Air by Monica Rowe, which is a fantastic book, and a virtual class visit from the author herself. So that'll be super fun. And then their piece will be published on the Literacy in Place website, and all writers retain the rights to their work. So if they want to publish it someplace else, they're more than welcome to. And then they'll also be featured in a series like this on Reading Rule Y'all. Second place will get a signed book of choice from our guest judges, and they will also be published on the Literacy in Place website and have an opportunity to have a guest spot on this Reading Rule Y'all podcast. If you want to check out last year's winner, you can do that by visiting the Literacy in Place website. I'll put that link in the description and show notes. And the winning story was called Fate for a Cat by Allison Strange of North Carolina. It was an excellent story. So check that out if you're looking for inspiration, or you just want to see last year's winner and see what it's all about. So like I said, if you're a rural ELA teacher or an ELA teacher that serves rural students in kind of an urban fringe, urban sprawl area, I hope you'll consider working this contest into your curriculum for the fall. Submissions are due December 1st by 11:59 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So check out the Literacy in Place website for more details on submission guidelines. I'm going to put the link in the description below and also in the show notes. And also feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. The second really exciting announcement is that the Whippoorwill Award winners for this year have been selected and announced. So look for an episode about them in the coming weeks, and hopefully lots and lots of future episodes featuring the winners. I've already scheduled a couple of interviews with award-winning authors, and I'm so excited to talk to them about their work. The books this year that were submitted for consideration were also wonderful, and so it was hard to choose, but the winners, it's a great set. So keep an eye out for that. The third announcement is that I have completed and checked off a bucket list item, and I'm extremely excited to announce that I teamed up with the Kendra Winchester over at Read Appalachia to share some Appalachian, or at least Appalachian adjacent, YA middle grades and kids lit suggestions. So if you're not familiar with Kendra's work or the Read Appalachia podcast, I kindly but firmly suggest that you remedy that immediately. Her work is amazing. I've admired it for so long, and I am so excited to be collaborating with her. It's seriously a dream come true, and I have to pinch myself because I just hardly can believe it. The podcast is so excellent. I listen to it faithfully and try to pick up some notes for this podcast because hers is so amazing. So definitely please check that out. And if you do, leave her a review on Apple Podcasts so other people can find her. And leave me a review too, if you would, while you're at it. The last announcement is that I have made some Literacy in Place and Reading Rule Y'all merch at TeePublic. So if you have ever wanted to share your support and get the word out about Literacy in Place and or Reading Rule Y'all to others via stickers or t-shirts or sweatshirts or magnets or coffee mugs or onesies, you can do it now because there are some super cool designs at TeePublic. So check out the link to the description, or the link to the storefront in the description below and in the show notes. And you can check it out and see if there's anything that you might be willing to purchase to support the show and also to continue to get the word out. Okay, phew. I think that's all the announcements I have. So now let's get on to this episode. Over the course of this episode, I'm going to give a little breakdown of the content of my book, Country Teachers in City Schools, The Challenge of Negotiating Identity and Place. I'm going to talk a little bit about the summary, about why I wrote it, which I also kind of talked about when I read from the introduction to the book at the top of this episode. And also, I'll talk individually about the chapters, what is in there, so you have a better idea of that, and a little bit about who I think could use this book and where I hope my work will go from here. I don't want to get too into a lot of it because Dr. Rob Petrone put on the host hat for this podcast and has interviewed me about the book, and so that'll be the next episode. And we talk a lot about all of this stuff. So this I just see as kind of like a primer or an introductory episode, and then that'll kind of connect to and pair with the author interview that we did. Thanks to Rob for having that idea and to being an excellent interviewer and asking great questions. I'm excited to put that interview out, and hope that you all will stay tuned and check it out when it drops. The reason I wrote this book was largely because I was trying to make sense of myself and who I was as a rural outmigrant. Not much of the rural research I could find talked about folks like me. There's some really great research on the fact that rural students are educated and taught that they need to leave in order to be successful. But there's not much work that follows the leavers once they leave into their new non-rural spaces. And there's not very much work that described what their identity building outside of their rural places looks like and feels like for them. I remember I read one piece, there was one sentence that said, rural people become suburban people and vice versa. So talking about outmigration and immigration. But that's it. That's all there was. There was no and this is how they do it, and this is what their identity building looks like, and this is why that's important, and this is what it looks like in particular for teachers. That's all there was. There was just that one short sentence. And so I was like, there's a big gap here that I need to know about. And so that's where this came from. At the time I was thinking about doing my dissertation project, I was really struggling to figure out who I was because I still identified as rural and still do, even though I was living in a large subdivision and attending an urban located and urban focused PhD program. And now, again, live in a subdivision, though I'm bordered all around by farms, though a lot of them are being sold to build more houses. So I felt like at the time I didn't know how to be in my new urban place, and that I was constantly required to defend myself, like how I engaged in discussion and conversation in classes, how I interacted with professors in the department. And so I had a hard time knowing how to engage in collegiality in this new space, how to make friendships and relationships in this new space. And I was just flabbergasted because I didn't have trouble at Purdue. But I think that's largely because all of the professors in my department were rural or rural connected. One grew up on a dairy farm in Michigan. One grew up in a tiny town in Missouri. One wrote curriculum in rural Alaska and had a cabin in his woods where he would write. Another one was from rural North Carolina. So it was the perfect place for me because in the midst of this enormous 40,000 person campus, I had all of these professors who understood me without me needing to explain myself. But that was not the case at UT Austin. So from those experiences and a need to make sense of them, the idea for my dissertation project was born. I wanted to learn more about how other rural outmigrant teachers made sense of who they were as people and how that affected what they did inside their urban and rurban. So where schools on like the edge of urban sprawl, where rural and urban kids are in the same classrooms, how they made sense of what they did in those urban and rurban classrooms. And then because the dissertation is not a really super accessible or enjoyable genre to read for most folks, I wanted to turn it into a book that would help other teachers and teacher educators explore and make space for their students to explore their geospatial identities and how those are connected to cultural practice and instructional practice. So that's why I wrote this book and why I dedicated it to anyone who has ever felt out of place. Because I think what I talk about in this book has a lot of connections to experiences of transnational folks and immigrants, even though it's not exactly the same because I didn't traverse national boundaries, which has, a ton of red tape and bureaucracy that goes with it that doesn't necessarily come with moving from a rural place to a non-rural place. I think there are still a lot of identity building processes that are similar across those experiences. So I'm hoping that this book appeals to a wide audience and can help a lot of people, since it's talking about an issue that hasn't really been talked about very much. So now let's talk about what's in the book. There are 9 chapters. Well, 10 really if you count the introduction anyway. But in the intro, I read a pretty generous portion of that at the top of the show. I describe how and why I came to this project. And I give a little bit of an overview of the book and what's in it, pretty typical introduction stuff. Chapter 1 is a theory building chapter where I think through how to define place and how place and identity building are connected. It works through how places and identities are both constantly in flux, that they're not static, that they don't stay the same, and how they are combinations of geography, of language, and interactions between humans and other humans and non-human objects, and how it's a really complex thing that we try to make simple. And then it also outlines the dominant narratives of rurality and urbanity. So the main single stories that get told about what it means to be rural and what it means to be urban. Chapter 2 introduces the teacher participants of the study in brief and then sort of describes the general process they undertook to build their identities as multi-layered and intersectional, as well as rural or non-rural. Some of my participants, even though they were rurally raised, didn't identify as rural anymore because they had spent so long living in the city. So that's what chapter 2 does. It sort of talks about how they went about this identity building work across places. Chapter 3 examines the complexities of teachers' identities through detailed portraits, and honestly is probably my favorite chapter of the whole book, the chapter I love the most, because I think that the portraits really work to capture who the people I was working with were and who they were striving to become in the moment of the study. And so I captured their places, like their offices and their classrooms, and also their language practices and who they were as people. I talk about, the stories that they told me about how they grew up and their background and where they grew up and what that meant to them. So I love that chapter. Chapter 3 is probably my favorite chapter of the whole book. It was the most fun to write too, because I got to tell stories, and that's really what I like to do most. Chapters 4 through 6 focus on specific elements of teachers' identity building and provide teaching applications to help teachers, whether at the secondary or the post-secondary level, tap into those with their students. So chapter 4 focuses on language as identity. Chapter 5 focuses on landscape as identity, and chapter 6 focuses on race, especially the sort of stereotype threat that rural people experience, especially rural white people experience when it comes to talking about race and whether or not they want to claim a rural identity because of the single story of rural people as racist. Chapter 7 considers the connection between teachers' personal and professional identities through an examination of the teacher's pedagogy and instruction. And Chapter 8 thinks about teacher implications for teacher preparation programs and also professional development. And finally, in Chapter 9, I wrap everything up by talking about the need for higher visibility of and more work to understand the lives and experiences and teaching and learning of rural outmigrants, because there are a lot of us. If you're a rural kid and you want to go to university, if you want to have a job that requires you to have a degree, you're probably going to have to leave your rural town in order to get that degree. And a lot of folks don't go back. Some folks do, but not everybody does or can. And so there are a lot of rural outmigrants in this, in the U.S. One thing also, because this is a U.S. focus book, I'm interested to learn more about what this process looks like in other places, other nations. But this study obviously focused on the U.S. context because that's where I am. In each of the chapters that focus on teachers' identity building, like language as identity, landscape as identity, there are teaching applications that teachers in secondary schools and also teacher preparation programs can use to invite students to engage with their geospatial identities and think about how it impacts them as people. And then for teacher educators, how their personal identities impact who they are as teachers. And then there's also really great, I include lots of examples from participants, photos that they shared with me from my data corpus and stuff like that. So I like it. I'm proud of it. And I hope that you will consider getting a copy and maybe even using it with your students in your classroom to think more about rural outmigration and even in-migration and just how moving across places impacts who we are as people and the sort of struggles that and challenges that come with that, but also, you know, the fun and joyful things that come with it too, because it's not all bad. But I did my best to make the writing in this book accessible for anyone and everyone, to make sure that the book is useful to folks at all levels of education. I connect a lot of what's here to my own experiences as an outmigrant, and I also try to include other stories from other folks that I've seen sort of out in the world. Like there's a story that Jason Isbell told in an interview with GQ magazine about a reading quiz that he took as a kid. And the book was about either birdshot or buckshot, and the question, it was a true-false question, and it was the opposite. So if the book was about buckshot, the question asked about birdshot, and he answered it false and got it wrong, but went like 12 rounds with his teacher about how he was right because birdshot and buckshot are not the same thing. And so but his teacher didn't understand. And so just sort of using stories like that as exemplars of the fact that like place and rurality and rural culture really matter in the course of teaching. And so I tried to make it accessible and not super highbrow ivory tower academic because I don't particularly enjoy reading stuff like that. And also it just doesn't feel like me, you know, it's not my primary language practice. So anyway, all of that to say that I hope it's accessible and enjoyable to read, whether you're a member of academia or not. And I loved this project so much. I never get tired of talking about it. and I'm hoping to do more work with rural outmigrants in the future. So thanks for being here and for giving me the opportunity to talk about it some more. If you got a copy and have read it, I'd love to hear what you think. And also, if you'd like to write an honest review for Literacy in Place, please let me know, because I'd really love that. I don't feel like I can write a review of my own book and publish it on my website. But if anybody has read it and would like to publish a review of it, that would be wonderful. So I think that's it for this time. Thanks again for tuning into this episode. I hope it's given you some insight into what's in the book, and that if you're a rural or a rural outmigrant secondary teacher, you consider picking it up to help you make sense of your own rurality and practice, as well as how to make sense of how that works in your classroom, and to allow students to process their own identities through some of the teaching applications that I include in the book. If you're a teacher educator, whether in a rural or suburban university, I hope you'll pick it up too and consider how to make space for your pre-service teachers to consider their geospatial identities and cultures, especially as it relates to the way it may or does shape their relationship building and instructional practices. Like I said in earlier parts of this episode, in the next episode, Dr. Rob Patrone takes the reins to interview me about the book and my writing process. So I hope you'll join us for that one. I always enjoy talking to Rob and would talk to him about rural education forever if life and my children would let me. So don't forget to check out the Literacy in Place website for more details on the Rural Teen Writing Contest. Please share with any rural teachers and or young rural writers you know. Follow me on social media for updates and reminders, and to share the cool stuff that's happening over here. You can find me at Literacy in Place on Instagram and Facebook, and at Reading Rural on Twitter. And then hop on over to our TeePublic storefront and pick you some stickers and coffee mugs, magnets, whatever you want. I know I'm going to order some. I feel like maybe that's counterproductive since they're to support the show, but I love stickers. I have started a collection of stickers on my bullet journal, and I think some Literacy in Place and Reading Rural Y'all stickers would be great additions to that. Okay, so that's it for real this time. I feel like this is a Midwestern goodbye of an episode. Don't forget to like and share this episode and or the show. If you'd review us on Apple Podcasts, that'd get that pesky algorithm to help other folks find us. And I'd really appreciate that a lot. So see you next time. Y'all come back now, would you?